At dawn, a silver whip cracks the quiet air, and 100 horses stand still, their rifles aimed at a silent boy who dares to say, "I'm not going back." Elias Ward rose before dawn, the horizon a thin smear of pale light against an ocean of prairie. His breath formed silver wisps that curled toward a sky still heavy with night. He swung into the saddle of his sorrel mare, Ivory, her flanks warm against his leg, and rode the fence line that marked the edge of his claim. For 12 years he'd known these fields, their shifting moods, the way the wind could carry hope and grief in equal measure. Each morning's ride was both ritual and penance, a measured beat in a life once ruled by the hammer of 6-shooters. The land lay silent save for the soft scrape of leather and the distant cry of a meadowlark greeting the dawn. His hand rested lightly on the Winchester at his side, not out of fear but habit, a ghost of the gunslinger he used to be. He passed the broken split-rail fence patched with fresh saplings, nodding to the work he'd done the week before. A settler's legacy was built in sweat and wood, not gunpowder and blood. Yet sometimes, when the prairie breathed just right, echoes of his past stirred beneath his ribs. The blast of gunfire, the hollow thud of his brother falling, the taste of regret. He rounded the bend above the creek and froze. Half buried in reeds at the water's edge, a shape stirred. Ivory snorted, shifting beneath him. Elias dismounted slowly, boots sinking into damp earth. There, crouched in the shallow current, was a boy, skin the color of moonlight, ribs visible beneath ragged remains of cloth. His arms bore scars, long and deliberate, each a testament to suffering no child should know. He sat so still it seemed the world held its breath around him. Elias knelt a few paces away, keeping his movements slow. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low and grainy like stones scraping. The boy's head lifted, eyes wide as winter lakes, reflecting a wild fear that had nowhere left to run. Elias unbuttoned his coat, revealing the wool lining. He peeled off one sleeve and held it out. The boy trembled, lips parting in a silent gasp. When Elias dropped the fabric to the ground, the boy flinched, but did not flee. He offered a piece of jerky next, crisp and smoky. The boy stared as though tasting kindness for the first time. Then, hesitating, he reached out with a slender hand and took it. His fingers shook, and he bit with such ferocity it broke Elias's heart. He had seen monsters before, greedy bankers, rustlers, men drunk on law, but never cruelty carved so cleanly into flesh. Elias scooped a handful of water into his palm and let it trickle into the boy's mouth. The boy closed his eyes against the chill as if drinking peace itself. Elias watched, the morning light touching their silent communion. In that moment, the boundary between Savior and sinner blurred. He had come seeking isolation. Instead, he found responsibility. He reached out, tracing a scar on the boy's forearm with gentle fingers. The boy flinched but did not pull away. Elias met his gaze. "You're safe now," he said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. The boy nodded once, tiny and fierce. In the hush before dawn fully broke, Elias knew this land would never be the same, and neither would he. The cabin door creaked as Elias shoved it closed behind him, shutting out the bite of the dawn wind. Inside, the hearth glowed a timid amber, embers flaring as he replenished the fire with oak split the day before. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine, of the livestock blanket hung damp by the door. He found the boy huddled on the far side of the room, knees drawn to his chest and arms wrapped tight around them. Micah's shoulders shook with silent tremors, as if the cold could steal more than warmth. It could steal the very will to stand. Elias set 2 tin cups on the rough-hewn table and ladled in broth simmered overnight, salted beef, wild onions, and a handful of root vegetables. He slid a bowl of boiled corn beside it, its kernels golden as prairie wheat at harvest. Then he chuckled softly, a rumble that startled the boy into looking up. "Eat, Micah," he said, voice gentle. "You've got miles of horizon to tend." The boy's gaze flickered over the food, a wariness etched in every drawn line of his face. At first, Micah touched nothing, too wary of kindness. Elias sat across, pipe between his teeth, and waited. Minutes passed, silence thick as molasses. Finally, hunger overcame fear. Micah lifted the bowl, scooped a handful of corn into his mouth, and chewed with trembling precision as though each bite was borrowed time. Elias studied him by firelight. The scars that ringed Micah's limbs were raised and pale, like bad memories refusing to fade. Some. Crisscrossed patterns, ridges old and white, while others ran fresh and angry, small rivers of red that hadn't yet scabbed. He'd seen gash marks from barbed wire, lines too straight for accidents. Whoever did this had meant to send a message: ownership, domination, terror. He rose and retrieved a basin of warm water from the stove's kettle, then opened his leather satchel and produced handfuls of cloth bandages and a jar of salve made from pine resin and lard. "Let me," he said, kneeling by Micah's side. The boy flinched at first touch, then closed his eyes against the burn of antiseptic. Elias worked methodically, rinsing grime from each open wound, smoothing the salve over raw flesh, wrapping gentle strips of cloth snug enough to protect but loose enough not to choke circulation. Micah bit his lip, knuckles whitening as Elias pressed the cloth in place. Each hiss of pain seemed to carve something into the older man's soul. He murmured soft assurances, promises he barely believed himself. "No one will hurt you here, not ever again." When the last bandage was set, Micah stared into the fire, eyes distant. Elias placed a heavy wool blanket over the boy's shoulders. "Sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." Micah nodded once, retreating into the cocoon of warmth. Elias settled in the rocker by the hearth, pipe lit, listening to the boy's steady breath. Outside, winter's ghosts rattled the cabin walls, but within, a fragile peace prevailed. Elias stared into the flames, knowing that healing was a journey forged in trust and time, and that each scar Micah bore was both burden and testament to a spirit unbroken. As the fire crackled low, he vowed silently that tomorrow he would teach the boy more than how to mend wounds. He would show him how to reclaim a life worth living. Spring's first light slid through the cabin window as Elias roused Micah from a sleep bereft of dreams. The boy sat stiffly on the cot, blanket wrapped around him like armor. Elias held out a battered tin cup of coffee, black, bitter, and strong. Micah accepted it with both hands, lips brushing the rim, eyes never leaving Elias's face. In the hush, the steam wreathed around them like a pact. Today, they would learn together. Outside, the ranch yawned awake. Horses stamped under their blankets. The wind carried the tang of damp earth and new growth. Elias led Micah to the tack room and pointed to the bridle on the wall. "We start with your mount," he said. Under the sorrel mare Ivory's vigilant eye, Elias demonstrated each motion, running a hand through the mane to calm the animal, checking the bit for sharp edges, looping the reins with firm, even pressure. Micah watched, his silence a cloak around him, absorbing every gesture. When it was his turn, Micah's fingers trembled as he reached for the bridle. Ivory snorted softly but stood still, patient and unhurried. Micah followed Elias's example, soft palm against the mare's neck, a gentle tug at the reins to test their spring. Elias nodded once, approving. Micah's shoulders unfurled slightly, pride curled around him like an ember made bright. Next came fence repair. They walked the boundary where a winter storm had snapped rails like brittle bones. Elias handed Micah a hammer and nails. And with each strike, the boy's confidence grew. They worked side by side in companionable silence, the rhythm of wood meeting metal as natural as breath. Micah's hands, once bandaged and wary, moved with growing assurance, fitting each rail into place. Elias paused only to observe the prairie line with satisfaction, then dropped his gaze to the boy's steady work. At midday, they paused by the creek. Elias unpacked salted beef and cornbread from his saddlebags. Micah ate without speaking, but with each bite, the lines of fear around his eyes softened. He watched the water ripple over rounded stones as though searching for words in its endless murmur. Elias lit his pipe, inhaling smoke that tasted of pine and tobacco. He considered speaking of the world beyond the ranch, the town, the prairies beyond the Sioux Range. But he remembered the boy's silence was both refuge and shield. In the afternoon, Elias mounted Ivory and gestured for Micah to follow. They galloped across the open field, wind tearing at their clothes, hearts pounding in time with hoofbeats. When Micah slipped in the saddle the first time, falling into Ivory's warm flank, Elias guided him gently back up. By the fifth run, Micah rode with eyes fixed on the horizon, posture straight, hands steady. Each moment in the saddle dissolved another layer of his fear. They returned at dusk, sweat and dust caking their brows. Elias handed Micah fresh water and a rag, guiding him to wipe his face. The boy paused, looking at Elias, and for the first time a soft exhale escaped. Him. A wordless thank you carried on the evening breeze. In that quiet exchange, Elias felt the bond cement. In silence, two souls marred by violence found communion in purpose. As night fell, Elias stoked the cabin fire and fetched a stack of split oak. He passed a fresh log to Micah, and together they rebuilt the hearth's glow. The prairie beyond their window lay dark and vast, but inside, each ember kindled a fragile hope, that in the language of trust and labor they would teach each other how to stand again. Spring pressed its green fingertips into every hollow, but the prairie still carried a chill that tugged at bones. Elias rode out at dawn, Ivory's hooves soft on sodden earth. He scanned the horizon where gray clouds chased dawn's pale light. But something else rode the wind, a faint metallic clink that didn't belong to fence nails or harness buckles. He slowed Ivory to a walk, listening. Ahead, the creek's rush swallowed most sounds, but the steel whisper grew sharper. Elias spurred Ivory toward the low rise south of the barn. There, hoofprints stained the mud, dozens of them, stamped deep in neat parallel lines. He dismounted, boots sinking into the swollen soil. 99 prints fanned out like the spokes of a wheel, all pointing toward his cabin. His heart thudded, but he kept his face smooth. Ivory nosed his hand, sensing danger. Elias knelt, pressing fingers into the wet earth, tracing the prints. Military formation, not bandit scatter. These tracks were too orderly, too intentional. Oh. He stood and gazed across the pasture where grasses bowed under a restless wind. Somewhere out there were riders with regimented purpose. He returned to the cabin at a brisk pace, the weight of realization settling like lead. Micah met him at the door, eyes wide. Elias laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "They're coming," he said plainly. Micah nodded, pale and silent, but the tilt of his head spoke volumes, understanding that this would be no casual encounter. Inside, Elias moved with deliberate calm. He fetched additional rounds from the locked chest, stacking them near the hearth. He braced heavy beams against the doorframe and draped blankets over windows to muffle gunfire. Micah watched and mirrored every motion, his small hands folding cloth and placing nails with steady precision. In the hush, the cabin seemed to inhale, gathering its breath before an inevitable storm. At midday they paused for a single meal, jerky, hard bread, and water poured from a tin canteen. Elias studied Micah's face by firelight, noting the boy's jaw clenched in determined silence. He offered a rare smile. "We'll stand together," he said softly. Micah nodded. They spent the afternoon mapping the cabin's weak points. Elias drew crude sketches in the dirt by the hearth, entry angles, sight lines through broken slats, fallback points in the lean-to barn. Micah leaned over them, tracing each line with a finger as though memorizing a lifeline. When dusk fell, they stood back to back in the lean-to, the barn skeleton providing cover. A single lantern flickered between them. Outside, the sound of horses, slower now, but still purposeful, rolled across the plains. Elias fingered the old revolver at his hip. Micah's rifle rested on the crate beside him, butt worn smooth by practice. In the smoky half-light, Elias met Micah's steady gaze. No words passed, but in that charged silence they sealed their unspoken vow. Come dawn, they would face whatever rode in, shoulder to shoulder. And when the prairie's whisper became the thunder of hooves, they would know that this fight was more than defense. It was the reckoning of two broken souls determined not to be broken again. Before the sun crested the distant hills, a single rifle report shattered the dawn's hush. Like a starting gun for a race neither man nor boy wished to run. Elias pivoted behind the barricaded door as splinters flew inward, chips of pine spraying the cabin floor. He braced his shoulder against the wood, firing blindly through a narrow gap. The recoil jolted his arm, but the shot rang true, and a horse whinnied in distress beyond the wall. Micah crouched beside the stove, heart hammering in his chest. Elias slid a Spencer rifle into the boy's hands, guiding his fingers to the lever. "Wait for the flash," Elias whispered tight against the roar of hooves pounding the earth. Micah nodded, knuckles white. He peered through a slit in the boards, saw the ghostly forms of cavalrymen emerging through drifting smoke. A second shot cracked, this one from Micah's rifle, and a rider sagged in the saddle, recoiling like a puppet with its strings cut. The boy's breath hitched, then steadied. Elias met his eyes and gave the smallest of nods. Micah exhaled and prepared another round, the rifle held with. Sudden assurance born of necessity. Outside, the riders pressed in, rifles leveled. Bragg's whip tip glinted as he barked a command. Bullets riddled the cabin walls, tearing wood and scattering dust. Elias grabbed Micah's arm. "Time," he growled. They slipped through the hidden side door into the lean-to barn, where stacked hay muffled their movement. The first crack of barn timber came soon after. An axed plank gave way under a cavalryman's boot. Wood splintered as he thrust his rifle barrel inside. Elias raised his revolver at point-blank range. The man froze, eyes widening through the gap, and Elias pulled the trigger. The echo thundered between beams. Micah dropped behind a stack of feed sacks, rifle trained on the new breech. A second horseman pressed his rifle muzzle against the gap, not realizing the boy's fierce aim. Micah squeezed the trigger. The shot jolted his shoulder, and the man slumped backward, rifle clattering. Micah staggered, gaze flickering to Elias, face pale but resolute. They retreated deeper, using hay bales for cover. Elias raked another gun barrel, each shot a ripple in the cavalry's formation. Outside, the riders paused, taken aback by such fierce defense. Bragg's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold fire! No more death today!" Horses stamped, restless under reins. The single command halted the volley. For a heartbeat, only the barn's creak and the boy's ragged breathing filled the space. Elias stood, pistols raised, and Micah stepped from behind the crates, rifle leveled at the exit. Bragg appeared in the doorway, whip coiled at his side, cavalry gathered behind him in rigid arc. His hat brim cast his eyes in shadow. "Yield the child," he rasped. His voice held grudging respect. This was no ordinary skirmish. Elias's blood pounded in his ears. He exchanged a fleeting look with Micah. The boy's grip tightened on the rifle, a silent vow that he would not be dragged back into darkness. The thunder of hooves had begun. The reckoning of wills hovered in the charged dawn air. Elias lowered his weapons just enough to speak. "You'll get him over my corpse." Micah's voice joined his father's defiance. "I'm not going back." The barn's rafters quivered as tension coiled tighter than any whip, a stand neither side could afford to lose. The dawn's chill settled into the lean-to as Elias and Micah stood their ground behind the stacked hay bales. Outside, Captain Bragg's riders shifted uneasily in the mud, rifles held but not raised. Bragg himself lingered in the doorway, whip coiled at his hip like a serpent poised to strike. He surveyed the pair with a calculated calm, as though appraising spoiled livestock rather than fugitives. "Ward," Bragg called, voice low but carrying across the narrow space. "I offered you a chance to end this without blood. Surrender the boy, and I'll see you both pardoned." He paused, letting the word hang. Micah's jaw tightened, eyes steady. Bragg's lips curved into a thin smile. "Pardon for harboring an escaped subject of the United States government." He flicked his whip loose. Its silver lash caught the lantern light. "You need to understand the stakes, Ward. This child isn't just any runaway. He's part of an experimental program up in New Mexico, one designed to produce obedience through—" He hushed his tone, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Through methods you'd find distasteful." Micah shifted, rifle barrel pressing against the wooden post above Bragg's head. The captain's smile faltered. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured, though he kept his revolver unholstered. "Let him speak." Bragg straightened, clearing his throat. "They branded these children, used ice baths and electric prods, whipped them until they—" His voice dropped as though describing sacred mysteries. "They broke their wills to make them tools." He met Micah's gaze, eyes narrowing. "They think he's the best they've produced." Micah's knuckles whitened on the rifle stock, but he said nothing. Then, slow as sunrise, he stepped forward, every motion deliberate. "I'm not a tool," he said, voice firm though still young, the words echoing against splintered beams. "I'm not property of you or your masters." Bragg's whip twitched. Brave words for someone who owes his life to the government's provision. Elias's voice cut through the tension. "Provision? You call that hell you put him through provision?" He advanced a step, revolver raised, but aimed at the floor. "That boy came here broken. I'm trying to fix him, not turn him into some damn automaton." Bragg's eyes flicked from Elias to Micah and back. He weighed their defiance, counting the odds and finding them disturbing. Then he spat into the mud. "Your mercy is ill-advised." He signaled with a tilt of his head. "Men, finish this." At the command, rifles cracked in unison, bullets chipped bales and kicked up hay in frantic showers. Elias and Micah dove for cover, returning fire in a measured spray. Each shot carried the weight of their words. Each pull of the trigger a painful punctuation in this brutal conversation. As the volley subsided, the air trembled with spent echoes. Micah peered over the bale, cheeks streaked with sweat and dust. Elias caught his eye and offered a quick, grim nod. They'd spoken their truths. Now their bullets would speak the rest. In the rising smoke and ringing silence, they prepared for the storm that would decide not just their fate, but the meaning of freedom itself. The barn's stale air trembled with the echo of silence that followed Micah's declaration. Outside, the cavalry's rifles wavered, muzzles hanging useless until Bragg's whip coiled in his hand like a watchful serpent. He stepped forward, boots scuffing hay, voice low and precise. "Do you truly believe that defiance will save you, boy?" Micah's grip on the Spencer tightened, finger brushing the lever. He met the captain's gaze without flinching, a stark contrast to the trembling child Elias first found by the creek. "It saved me this far," Micah replied, voice steady as iron on steel. Bragg's jaw clenched. Behind him his men shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to press the attack or await orders. The wind carried the scent of sweat and fear, of hay dust and gun oil, a heady breath that clung to every soul in the lean-to. Elias felt it in his bones, the fragile moment before violence blooms. Bragg flicked his whip tip, a polished slash of silver catching the lantern's glow. "Your courage is misplaced. You belong to the government. That boy has secrets we intend to uncover, knowledge worth more than any frontier fence." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Stand down, Ward. Lay down your weapon, and I'll see you both go free." Elias's finger hovered near his revolver's trigger, but he did not lower his arms. Instead, he spoke with measured calm, voice graveled by long years under sun and sin. "You've already shown me what free means to you." He nodded toward the bloodstains on the barn's floor, the bodies of men who'd sought to claim this child. "We've no illusions." Bragg's men shifted again, restless under the weight of their master's uncertainty. Micah glanced at Elias, a silent question shining in his eyes. What next? Elias met him with a small, resolute nod. "Very well." Bragg's whip dropped, the crack of resolve louder than any gunshot. "Then let us finish this." At his signal, the riders pressed in, rifles rising like a forest of iron. The barn's single lantern winked out as the first volley spat flame through the doorway. Splinters exploded into the loft, raining dust and panic. Elias and Micah sank into cover, hearts pounding in unison. Elias raked the doorway with his revolver, each shot a thunderous sentence in a conversation the cavalry refused to understand. Micah, steadied by the memory of his own scars, squeezed the Spencer's lever, delivering answers in sharp reports that never missed their mark. Their combined rhythm was brutal and urgent, words exchanged in bullets, declarations carved into wood and bone. The cavalry's advance faltered as more men fell, the lean-to turning into a crucible of smoke and echoes. Bragg, pinned behind a splintered beam, watched his command unravel. His face, once set in imperial authority, slackened with disbelief. The boy's silence had been defiance enough. His voice had become a catalyst for every wounded soul taking shelter in this barn. When the final shot faded, an uneasy stillness reclaimed the space. Hay smoldered in corners, and the thick air rattled with spent brass rolling across the floorboards. Elias lowered his weapon, chest heaving, and glanced at Micah, his silent partner, now a warrior forged by words and wounds alike. Bragg emerged from the shadows, whip limp at his side. His cavalry lay scattered outside, the regiment broken by two defenders whose resolve neither uniform nor rank could shatter. He met Elias's gaze, eyes dark with grudging respect. "You may have won today," he admitted, voice tight, "but this land only tolerates victors." Elias squared his shoulders, the weight of past sins and present mercy balancing on the edge of that word. Then let this be its first lesson. Mercy wins more souls than force. Remember it. As dawn's light filtered through shattered boards, the barn bore witness to a truce not won by treaties, but by the fierce poetry of a boy's resolve, and a rancher's vow that scars, like words, could change the fate of those who carried them. Smoke curled among the shattered beams as Elias and Micah emerged from the lean-to, dust clinging to their clothes like anxious ghosts. Around them, the prairie lay silent save for the soft whicker of wounded horses, their flanks heaving as they watched owners and captors fall in the dirt. Elias knelt beside a bay mare, gently pressing a cloth to a bleeding shoulder. Micah bent over a chestnut stallion, tightening a makeshift splint around its splintered leg. Their movements were quiet, reverent, acts of mercy amid violence. Elias's fingers trembled as he tied the bandage. The mare bit at the cloth, soft muzzle warm against his palm. He looked up at Micah, watching the boy's jaw set as he worked. In the haze of spent gunpowder, Elias was carried back 12 years, to the duel that ended his brother's life. He remembered the sting of cold iron at his hip, the echo of rosewood grips biting into his palm, the sick realization that binding wounds with salve could never mend the hollow in his soul. He swallowed the memory and focused on the present. "Easy now," he murmured to the bay, voice as steady as sunrise. Micah glanced over, eyes bright with unspoken understanding, as though the rancher's private grief had become their shared burden. They finished tending the horses, stepping around spent casings and the scattered bodies of Bragg's men, their uniforms torn and stained. Elias found himself drawing deep on the prairie air, the smell of sage, blood, and smoke, which burned his lungs into clarity. Together they carried each fallen cavalryman a short distance from the barn and laid them side by side. Elias gathered fence rails and with Micah's help fashioned simple crosses. At each marker, Elias pressed a hand to the splintered wood and whispered a brief benediction. No names, no ranks, only respect for lives lost in a conflict born of cruelty. Micah watched, head bowed, and placed his own hand atop Elias's, sharing the weight of absolution. When the last marker stood, they climbed the rise overlooking the ranch. Below them, fences lay broken, the barn smoldered, and horses drifted back to greener grass. Elias placed a hand on Micah's shoulder. The boy turned, eyes reflecting the flicker of distant flames. "We did what we had to do," Elias said softly. Micah nodded once, voice thinned by emotion. "We chose each other." Elias drew a long breath, the vast sky open and indifferent above them. This land remembered every scar, every drop of blood. Yet it also remembered how life returned, green shoots pushing through charred earth. He looked at Micah, seeing not a victim but a survivor whose silence had become defiance, and whose scars told not only of pain but of endurance. As the sun dipped low, painting wind ripples of gold across the plains, Elias felt a quiet resolution settle in his chest. The battle was over, but the aftermath would demand more than muskets and salves. It would require forgiveness for the past, for the choices made, and for the lives taken. He squeezed Micah's shoulder. "Tomorrow we rebuild." Micah offered a small, determined smile, the first true curve of hope on his young face. Together they rode back toward the cabin, silhouettes against a land cradling its wounds, ready once more to rise. The sun rose pale and tentative over smoldering timbers, gilding each wisp of smoke as though the prairie lent its mercy even to ruin. Elias and Micah rode out at first light, stepping carefully among blackened rafters and buckled boards. Where the lean-to once sheltered grain and tools, only twisted nails and ash remained. Yet in the hush of dawn, the land whispered of new beginnings. Elias dismounted and ran a hand along the charred beam of what had been the barn's outer wall. The wood was brittle beneath his palm, but faint traces of green moss clung to its base, proof that life endured even here. Micah knelt beside him, picking through embers until he uncovered a singed horseshoe, its cold iron a symbol of resilience. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without a word. They set to work in companionable silence. Elias squared each fallen post, driving fresh stakes into the sodden ground. Micah passed him planks, his hand steady though his muscles trembled with effort. When a joist cracked under Elias's weight, scattering splinters, the boy reached out to brace it, eyes bright with concern. In that shared moment, Elias felt a knot of pride and protection unfurl in his chest. By midday, they had fashioned a temporary lean-to of canvas and sapling poles. Horses nosed through the new shelter, whickering gratefully as they shook soot from their flanks. Elias guided Micah through the basics of carpentry, measuring lengths with a keen eye, cutting boards true with a broad-bladed saw, and fitting each beam with purpose. Micah listened, repeating instructions in murmured echo, his silence now a deliberate focus rather than fear, while Micah laid fresh rails around. The pasture, Elias gathered buckets of water from the creek. Each trip wet his boots and chilled him to the bone, but he welcomed the sting. It reminded him that he was alive and accountable for each breath. He poured water onto the embers still glowing beneath the barn's center, settling the last of the smoke so they could rebuild without hazard. In the afternoon light, they paused on the cabin's porch, sweat drying on their brows. Elias produced a battered harmonica from his coat, an instrument he hadn't touched since his brother's funeral, and offered it to Micah. The boy's fingers trembled as he lifted it, uncertain. Elias placed his hand over the boy's, guiding him through a single, wavering note that cracked the prairie's quiet like a tentative promise. Micah closed his eyes, inhaled, and produced a second, steadier refrain. As dusk tinted the sky with bruised purples, Elias and Micah sat on a reborn fence rail, sharing the dwindling light. The ranch lay before them, scarred, yes, but alive, its pulse steady beneath their feet. Elias lit his pipe and exhaled smoke that curled toward the stars. Micah watched the embers, then met Elias's gaze, a softness blooming in his young eyes. Elias offered a rare, slow smile. "We've come a long way," he said. Micah nodded, lifting the harmonica to his lips once more. The note floated across the fields, a simple melody of survival. In that music, two souls scarred by violence found a quiet redemption, shaped by sweat, mercy, and the promise that dawn always follows even the fiercest blaze. By dawn's pale gray light, the rebuilt barn stood sturdy once more, its new sapling beams straight as rifle barrels, joined by fresh planks that smelled of resin and hope. Elias and Micah approached side by side, each carrying a lantern whose flames danced with promise rather than panic. The wind sighed through the open doorway, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, reminders that life would always push through ruin. They paused at the threshold. Elias ran a hand over the smooth grain of a joist, where Micah's initials were carved beside a simple cross. "Yours and mine," Elias said softly. Micah nodded, shoulders squared. Though the boy still spoke little, his actions bore a new language, one of purpose rather than fear. Inside, Elias collected tools, saw, hammer, plane. He set them on a workbench beside a stack of cedar boards. "Today," he said, "we'll build the fence gate." Micah wiped his hands on his trousers and took the plane, smoothing a board's edge with careful strokes. Each curl of wood that fell at his feet seemed to speak of progress, scars transformed into art. As they worked, Elias watched Micah's expression soften. The boy paused, tracing the seam where two boards met. "Why do we mark a cross for the dead?" Micah's question emerged quietly, unhurried as sunrise. Elias set down his hammer, folding his arms against his chest. "Because every life leaves a scar, just like this land," Elias replied, lifting a broken fence rail from the ground. "And every scar is a story. Those markers remind us that even in loss, we owe respect, and that we carry their memory into whatever we rebuild." Micah considered this, then nodded, stepping forward to place the rail beside the others. His movements were deliberate and reverent, as though laying down burdens no longer his to bear alone. Elias handed him the hammer, and the boy drove the nail with a firm strike that rang through the still air. They built in companionable silence, punctuated by the rhythm of tools on wood. As midday approached, the gate took shape. 2 wide boards braced with an X of cedar planks, hinges of wrought iron swinging easily on stout posts. When the final nail was set, Elias and Micah stepped back to admire their work. The gate stood proud against the prairie's sweep, a threshold between past and future. Elias cut a length of rope and looped it through an iron ring fashioned into a latch. "Open it," he told Micah. The boy lifted the gate and let it swing free, the sound of wood moving on metal echoing like a breath released. He turned to Elias, eyes shining with something new, ownership of self, of land, of destiny. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "A gate marks both entrance and exit," he said quietly. "You choose where you go from here." Micah's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, the first born of choice rather than circumstance. He walked through the gate onto the prairies beyond, paused to look back, then strode forward into the wide-open world. Behind him, Elias closed the gate with a soft click, the final seal on 2 lives irrevocably changed by scars they refused to let define them. Morning broke with a solemn hush, the horizon glowing pale gold, as though the prairie itself paused to honor what had passed. Elias stirred first, boots crunching the frost-hardened earth outside the cabin. He paused at the doorway, inhaling the crisp air that carried distant birdsong and the faint scent of cedar from the new fence gate. In that breath, he felt the weight of every choice he'd made, each scar, each shot fired, and the mercy he had carved out alongside the violence. Inside, Micah lay beneath the wool blanket on the cot, breathing easily for the first time in months. His face was peaceful, unmarked by nightmares, as though the barn's battle and the ranch's rebirth had exorcised the ghosts that once haunted him. Elias knelt beside the boy, gently tucking the blanket around his shoulders. Micah stirred, eyes drifting open, warm and steady. "Morning," Elias said softly. The word felt strange, light, unburdened. Micah offered a small, genuine smile. He sat up, reaching out to run fingers over the horseshoe tucked beneath his pillow. "Today?" he asked, voice clear. Elias nodded, rising and pulling on his coat. "Today the land remembers. And we remember with it." He held out a worn leather satchel. Inside lay 2 tin cups and a flask of coffee. Micah rose and followed Elias to the porch. They shared the steaming brew in companionable silence, watching as the sun climbed higher, scattering long shadows across repaired fences and grazing horses. After their drink, they mounted Ivory together, Micah in front so he could see the world beyond the gate. Elias guided the mare through the open pasture, leading Micah across the same ground where tracks of cavalry once marred the mud, but now the earth was soft with new grass, the hoof-prints smoothed by wind and time. Each stride carried them farther from fear and toward a future neither had dared imagine. They reached the ridge overlooking the creek where Elias had first found the silent boy. The water flowed smooth and cool, reflecting the dawn sky like a living mirror. Micah dismounted, running his hand through the current, watching it swirl over polished stones. He dipped the horseshoe into the water, turning it over and over until the last traces of ash washed away. Elias watched, remembering how different this place had been, the site of Micah's deepest wounds and Elias's darkest regrets. Now it gleamed with renewal. Micah met his gaze and, without words, handed him the horseshoe. Elias took it, holding the cold iron in his palm as though it were a sacred token. They mounted again, riding back toward the cabin. Behind them, the ranch woke fully, crows flapping from fence posts, cattle lowing for feed, and the barn's new timbers creaking with life. The gate swung slightly in the breeze, a threshold both crossed and defended. As they rode, Elias felt the prairie's quiet blessing settle over him. No longer just a land of penitence, it had become a home where mercy and memory walked side by side. He glanced at Micah, whose eyes shone with the vast possibilities of each new dawn. In the distance, the sun crawled upward, burning off the last tendrils of night. Elias reined in Ivory and spoke into the still morning air. "This is our story now." Micah leaned forward, resting his chin on Elias's saddle horn. Together they faced the rising sun, two survivors bound by scars and redemption, ready to write whatever chapters lay ahead.